We continue unpacking today's significant swearing in of the president, which has ushered in a new era, an era of co-governance where a greater level of political maturity will be required from all political parties to redirect this South African ship down a path of political and economic prosperity. Well, to help us make sense of this moment and the road ahead under the Government of National Unity is award-winning journalist and author Qaanitah Hunter. Good afternoon, Qaanitah. Thank you very much for joining us. So you wrote a very optimistic article on the road ahead and what is required for the GNU to succeed. But before we get into that article, just take us through your views of the president's address today.
I think the president struck the perfect balance of, appreciating where we are as a country and the concerns that South Africans may have versus what he pledges to be, for the road ahead. South Africans want change. If there is no change that comes from the Government of National Unity, it will be meaningless. And I think the president struck a very presidential tone and very optimistic outlook. And I think the reaction from the guest presence, from the dignitary presence, and in fact from the markets show a very clear indication of where South Africans are. It was a tense 2 weeks, Mfundo, from the 29th of May, from the time we got an indication of what the results were. And it is not a moment to take lightly that we had such a seamless transfer from one administration to the other, technically, even though a president was re-elected. He is not being re-elected the same way he was elected the first time around. And therefore, I think that the president said the right things. And for me, what really stood out is his commitment to a capable and honest government. You say what is needed for the GNU to succeed is a level of political maturity and patriotism perhaps not seen before. Do you think the political parties we have now actually possess this level of political maturity? Because just on the eve of the inauguration, we're seeing a bit of a back and forth between the Democratic Alliance and the ANC, particularly around the ANC's decision to invite other political parties into the GNU. So I think that we're up until this point, and I stress the point, Fundo, that up until this point, it has been the easy part, negotiating this unity government, which is in fact a multi-party coalition, has been the easy part. Now the actual operationalizing of it, and I've warned multiple times in public forums that that's going to be, the devil is in the detail, and up until now there has been no detail. But what I say is that what we saw from both the DA and the ANC and other political parties as well, in terms of the how they are presenting themselves to the negotiations, for me, sets an optimistic part. Will there be disagreement? Of course there'll be disagreement. In fact, I was expecting way more disagreement besides, the modalities of what the GNU will look like. I think the president is sort of just enjoying the moments with dignitaries now from all over the world until the real work starts tonight, is in trashing out the details. If the PAC, for example, says they're joining the GNU, does that come with an automatic reciprocation of a position? What about the Patriotic Alliance? And so those iterations are going to be interesting to see how the president works that out. But those, so when I say I am optimistic, I'm cautiously optimistic with some prerequisites. And what are those prerequisites for the GNU? The early part. I'm not talking about the actual running of the state. I'm just talking about getting an agreement off paper and up and going, is that there have to be a level of coherence. And I think that overnight what we saw about where the ANC thinks the GNU is going versus where the DA can affect that particular prerequisite, which is to be absolutely clear on where you are heading.
But with the minimal detail, do you get a sense that there is clarity? Because yes, in as much as you talk about the devil being in the detail, with the minimal detail and just the statement of intent, it seems there are various interpretations from just these two political parties.
I think that was always the case, but I do think the fact that you have that basis and that document went through 14, 15 draft iterations and back and forth, for me, and the negotiation that happened there was a good sign. The fact that you had the Democratic Alliance pushing back and the president himself pushing back on how decisions to be taken. Essentially, the ANC wanted a loose agreement with the Democratic Alliance, and the DA said absolutely not, that they want to be part. So the president cannot make decisions without sufficient consensus. And what is that sufficient consensus? Sufficient consensus means 60% of parties represented in the agreement will have to then we'll have to make decisions together. And so if the DA doesn't agree to something, it can't essentially happen unless the DA and the IFP. I think that the fact that we had that basis, yes, let's take foreign policy, for example, that there is this clause that this is how we will approach foreign policy. What happens on a workable level is a different story. But I think that what signals me, and I think other analysts and other people looking at, especially from the markets, looking at the agreement so far, is the fact that you had this kind of alignment in a world where people didn't think was possible, and that the political parties were able to come together and say, all right, this is how we could possibly work together. Now the question is how much the ANC is willing to give and how much the DA is willing to give in operationalizing it. And that goes way beyond the announcement of cabinet. Because remember, in the past, what would the president do after the inauguration? He would meet with the ANC Secretary General. He'd meet with the ANC officials. He'll phone his friends. He'll probably phone James Mulatsi, other of his confidants. He'll speak to his political advisors and then come together with a first version of the cabinet, and that gets discussed, with alliance partners, with COSATU, and then another iteration, and then that is kind of just presented to the ministers and then presented to the public, right? That process, as we know it, can't happen anymore because there has to be what we now know as quote unquote sufficient consensus. Who actually is part of that? And where does the decision making stand? So the question is, starting off, what is the size of the cabinet?
Yes.
Are we going bigger? Are we going smaller? Where do the original powers lay? Does the president say, I'm taking away functions from the deputy president and empowering the minister in the presidency? He can do that. It's his prerogative to do
Which
that.
is what we hear would be desirable for the Democratic Alliance, because it seems as though they're saying John Steenhuisen would possibly want to be a minister in the presidency and also perhaps to have that specific role as leader of government business being brought there. As you say, he does have the prerogative, or the Constitution does permit such. But beyond this, Qaanitah, just in the interest of time, I want to just get your sense on some of the portfolios, because we understand from reports that the Democratic Alliance has no interest in finance. They also have no interest in social development. What they really want are the portfolios that will ensure that they achieve their 7 points from their rescue plan and their manifesto, and among those being energy, trade and industry, as well as water and sanitation. Talk us through some of this and help us make sense of why specifically these ones would be the low-hanging fruit for them.
So the reality of it is the DA doesn't want problematic portfolios. You wouldn't want to have social development because of the enormous need versus the reality of what government can deliver, right? Housing, for example. And so what it wants is to show it needs by the next election, or at least by the next local election, it needs to have an example, a tangible example of this is what we've done with the little power we got in cabinet, and therefore vote for us. Otherwise, they would have been completely unsuccessful. And so what I think is important is if the DA is able to sort of create coherence around policy and get foreign direct investment, they'll claim it as a win. Similarly, when it comes to sorting out the energy portfolio, there's two things I'm very interested in, Fundo. The first is, will the president split mineral resources and energy/electricity? So take energy and electricity, make it one, and then keep mining as a separate, as it was before. Remember, the president combined the two. And which does he give out and which does he keep for the ANC? So that's interesting for me. The second thing that I find superbly interesting is the security portfolios and justice. I know the ANC wants to keep its on the security cluster, and I do think there's an appetite from opposition parties to say, you guys can have that. And then just to add a third thing is the minister in the presidency is essentially whatever the president wants it to be. It never has, the president now had a few ministers in the presidency, right? He has made intelligence one of the functions of the minister and that can be completely redesigned. So how they craft that kind of blank check position of minister in the presidency is going to be interesting. And does it diminish the powers of the deputy president rather? And then the other thing that I'm quite interested in is how does the president dispense patronage through deputy minister positions? Remember, deputy ministers are ceremonial in many ways because they have no powers. They cannot stand in for ministers. Some people call them glorified ribbon cutters. And so how then does the president use those positions, which he can appoint endless amounts? There's no limit to that, in dispensing patronage to other political parties, the smaller ones that have agreed to come on board in this quote-unquote government of national unity.
It's honestly very interesting times. Qaanitah, thank you very much for your insights this afternoon. That's Qaanitah Hunter, an award-winning journalist and author, speaking to us there.